Thank you.
I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. New Zealand First also supports this year's Subordinate legislation, confirmation and validation bill. Amongst other things, as we know, the bill would validate this year's New Zealand superannuation rate order, and that would increase the rate of New Zealand superannuation as set out in Schedule 2 by approximately 2% overall. However, for people living entirely on New Zealand superannuation, this will nevertheless, even at almost 2%, be very welcome. But I think it's hardly enough really for a reasonable retirement income these days when you take into account rates of increase in power, the quite significant increases in local authority rates, which we've seen in recent times, significant increases in insurance for reasons that will be fairly obvious, and many other basic living expenses. It seems to me highly unlikely that almost 2% would realistically really cover all of that and a lot more. In fact, over many years, successive governments have whittled away the New Zealand superannuation entitlement one way or another. And as we know, Labor wants to increase the age of eligibility from 65 to 67. The government has not really shown its hand about what it plans for New Zealand superannuation in the future. And as a result, there's much speculation about what will happen to New Zealand superannuation in future years. One way or the other, I think baby boomers are going to get a bad deal, whichever of the major parties succeed in 2014 and beyond. I consider that to be something of a breach of a social contract. We were told decades and decades ago that there was this social contract in the form of a taxation-based system where we would all pay our taxes over our working lives and we would get an entitlement to New Zealand superannuation from tax sources in the future. And the point about this is that that is an undertaking that I think has been breached. And it doesn't matter what people from Labor or National say, people in the community know that it's been whittled away over time and that they can expect the same to happen in the future. In fact, they also know that there is only one party, New Zealand First, which can be relied upon, A, to keep the age of eligibility at 65 years, with no reduction in the rate and the way it is calculated, and when possible, New Zealand First would increase the rate by at least 1 or 2 percentage points in relation to the average wage to recognise the hardship that we all know people who are living entirely on New Zealand superannuation are suffering. And we do think, as distinct from the other parties, that this is affordable if priorities are well ordered for the government and if we get real growth in the economy. And I think that's a priority also which both parties have not done very well on. It can be done, should be done and must be done. But in fact much more is needed too. And there's been a huge silence about some of the main issues surrounding New Zealand superannuation. For example, the issue of overseas pensions and eligibility for immigrants needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed urgently. Immigrants resident in New Zealand for at least 10 years still get full New Zealand superannuation, whereas they may have made little or no contribution to the New Zealand economy. And then there's the New Zealand diaspora, 1 million people, 500,000 in Australia. A silver tsunami which may return to New Zealand at an unknown rate of arrivals in the future. Many of those, even though they may have spent most of their working life overseas, may qualify and become entitled to 100% of New Zealand superannuation. On the other hand, there are people bringing into New Zealand who are entitled to bring into New Zealand an overseas pension that they've earned overseas, only to have it deducted under Section 70 of the Social Welfare Act from their New Zealand superannuation, even if it is a contributory scheme that they have earned overseas. Whereas KiwiSaver in New Zealand does not get deducted from New Zealand superannuation. So there are many anomalies, those and many more, and too much unfairness surrounding all of those issues, especially for immigrants and returning expatriates to New Zealand, which are not being addressed, weren't addressed by Labor, are not being addressed by National. That unfairness needs to stop. Those, however, of course, are detailed issues for another day, but they are urgent. For today's purposes, New Zealand First is happy to support a bill to validate the superannuation increases which are so sorely needed, and I just regret that we cannot do more for people who are living solely on New Zealand superannuation. As many of them know, New Zealand First wishes to improve the Super Gold Card and other benefits which would go with New Zealand Super. They cannot rely on either of the main parties to do any of that. Only New Zealand First really looks after people who are reliant on New Zealand superannuation. However, for today's purposes, New Zealand First will be happy to support the bill.
I call Tim McIndoe.
Speaker, I'd like to congratulate Mr O'Rourke for managing to